The small town of Pinewood hadn't seen a gathering this large in years. The sky hung gray and heavy above the old brick chapel, matching the mood of the nearly 200 people who had come to say goodbye to Dr. Edward Harmon. Rain threatened but hadn't yet fallen, as if the weather itself was holding its breath out of respect. Cars lined both sides of Elm Street, some with license plates from as far away as Nevada and Maine. Dr. Harmon's work with bugs and spiders had made him something of a legend in science circles, but here in Pinewood he was simply their neighbor, the kind man with wild gray hair who taught at the college and always stopped to chat at Porter's General Store. Inside the chapel, every wooden pew was filled. People stood along the back wall and spilled into the small foyer. Some dabbed at their eyes with tissues while others stared straight ahead, still trying to process that the town's beloved bug expert was truly gone. In the front row, Margaret Harmon sat with her shoulders straight despite the weight of her grief. At 65, she looked older today than she had just a week ago when Edward was still alive. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple black dress that Edward had always liked. She had woken up today with no energy to pick out clothes, but she knew he would have wanted her to wear this one. 40 years of marriage had taught her what made him smile. Next to her sat their daughter, Eliza. Unlike her mother's neat appearance, Eliza looked like she had been through a storm. Her curly brown hair stuck out in places despite her attempts to smooth it down. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, the result of the 30-hour journey from her research station in Australia. She had been studying coral reefs when the call came about her father's heart attack. Too late to say goodbye, but just in time for the funeral. He would have been so touched, whispered an older woman as she leaned over the pew to squeeze Margaret's shoulder, to see all these people here for him. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The truth was, Edward would have been embarrassed by all the fuss. He had been a quiet man who preferred the company of his 8-legged friends to most people. But he would have appreciated knowing he had made a difference in so many lives. Pastor Bill had just finished reading a poem about nature that had been one of Edward's favorites. The words had floated up to the wooden beams of the chapel ceiling, speaking of the cycles of life and the wisdom found in the smallest creatures. Now Edward's oldest friend and colleague, Dr. Tom Walsh, approached the simple wooden podium to deliver the eulogy. Tom adjusted his glasses and looked out at the sea of faces. "Edward Harmon taught me 2 important things," he began, his voice catching slightly. "First, that there is nothing on this earth too small to be worthy of our attention and respect. And second, that no amount of academic success matters if you don't also succeed at being kind." Eliza reached over and took her mother's hand. Margaret squeezed back, grateful for the connection. Tom continued, sharing stories from their 40 years of friendship and research together. He talked about expeditions to the Amazon, where Edward had discovered a previously unknown species of jumping spider. He mentioned Edward's patient teaching style that had inspired generations of students, and he made people laugh with tales of Edward's notorious absent-mindedness, like the time he showed up to teach wearing mismatched shoes because he'd been so excited about a new spiderweb pattern he'd observed that morning. As Tom spoke, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside and streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished surface of the mahogany casket. The casket was closed, decorated simply with a spray of white lilies and ferns, plants from Edward's own garden. The sudden brightness seemed to shift something in the room. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her for the first time since the paramedics had called. Edward wouldn't want all this sadness. He had lived a good life, a life full of discovery and wonder. The thought brought the ghost of a smile to her lips. Tom was wrapping up now. In his final paper, published just last month, Edward wrote that the more we learn about the creatures we share this planet with, the more we realize how little we truly understand. That was Edward. Always learning, always wondering, always reminding us to stay humble in the face of nature's complexity. He stepped away from the podium, nodding respectfully toward Margaret before returning to his seat. Pastor Bill stood again, asking everyone to bow their heads for a final prayer before the casket would be taken to the cemetery for burial. The chapel fell silent except for the occasional sniffle or the rustle of a program. Pastor Bill's gentle voice guided them through words of comfort and hope. Margaret kept her eyes closed, trying to picture Edward's face, not as she had last seen it, gray and still in the hospital bed, but laughing as he had been just days before while telling her about his latest discovery. It was in this moment of deep silence that the first person noticed it. A small gasp came from somewhere near the middle of the chapel. Then another. Soon, a wave of whispers rolled from the back of the room toward the front. Margaret opened her eyes, annoyed at the disruption during the prayer. Pastor Bill had paused, his expression confused. Eliza was looking around too, trying to understand what had caused the sudden stir. Then Margaret saw it, and her heart seemed to stop. On top of Edward's casket, in stark contrast to the white lilies, sat the largest spider most people in the room had ever seen. It was black and brown, with a body the size of a man's palm and legs that stretched out to cover an area as large as a dinner plate. Its presence was so shocking, so out of place in the somber setting, that for a moment everyone simply stared. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "What is that thing?" came another voice. "Is it real?" The funeral director, a thin man named Pete, who had known the Harmon family for decades, took a hesitant step forward, clearly at a loss for how to handle this unexpected situation. His face had gone pale and he looked to Margaret as if for guidance. But Margaret wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the spider with an expression that puzzled everyone who noticed it. There was no fear in her eyes. Instead, there was something that looked almost like recognition. The spider moved slightly, adjusting its position on the smooth wood of the casket. Its movement sent another ripple of gasps through the congregation. A woman in the third row stood up abruptly and began edging toward the aisle, pulling her young son along with her. "It's one of those deadly ones from South America," a man's voice stated with authority. "We should kill it before it bites someone." This seemed to break the spell. Several men stood up, including Tom Walsh, who shook his head firmly. "Don't anyone move," he said in his professor voice. "That's a Goliath bird-eater tarantula. They're not aggressive unless provoked." But his words did little to calm the growing panic. People were standing now, some moving toward the exits while others pressed forward for a better look. The peaceful funeral had transformed into a scene of confusion and fear in a matter of seconds. Through it all, Margaret remained seated, her eyes fixed on the giant spider. Eliza noticed her mother's unusual calm and leaned close. "Mom," she whispered, "are you okay?" Margaret finally turned to look at her daughter. There were tears in her eyes, but also something else, a spark that Eliza hadn't seen since before her father's death. "It's Matilda," Margaret said simply, her voice filled with wonder. "Matilda?" Eliza repeated, confused. Then understanding dawned on her face. "Dad's spider, but that's impossible. She's at home in her enclosure, and how would she even get here?" Margaret slowly rose to her feet. The movement caught the attention of those nearby, who fell silent, watching. She stepped forward until she stood directly in front of the casket, face to face with the enormous spider that had caused such a commotion. "Hello, old friend," she said softly. The spider remained perfectly still, its 8 eyes seemingly focused on Margaret. Pastor Bill had backed away, prayer book clutched to his chest. Pete, the funeral director, looked like he might faint. But Margaret stood her ground, a small woman facing down what many considered a nightmare creature, with nothing but tenderness in her expression. "Folks," she said, turning to address the stunned congregation, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "Please don't be afraid. This is Matilda." The room fell silent as everyone waited for an explanation. How did this woman know the giant? Spider by name, why wasn't she screaming or running? And most puzzling of all, what was a creature like this doing at a funeral in the first place? What happened next would be the talk of Pinewood for years to come. The chapel had turned into a scene of barely controlled chaos. Some people stood frozen in the aisles, unable to decide whether to flee or stay. Others had their phones out, recording the bizarre sight of Margaret Harmon standing calmly before a spider the size of a dessert plate. Pete, the funeral director, had backed all the way to the wall, his professional composure completely abandoned. "Please, everyone," Margaret said, raising her hands. Her voice, though soft, somehow cut through the noise. "There's no need to panic." Tom Walsh moved to stand beside her, lending his authority to her words. "Margaret's right. Let's all take a breath. Here." A heavy-set man in the back called out, "That thing's dangerous. Someone needs to kill it before it attacks someone." Margaret's face hardened. "No one is killing anything in my husband's funeral." The steel in her voice surprised even those who had known her for years. This was not the quiet, supportive wife they were used to seeing in Edward's shadow. This was a woman with unexpected strength. Eliza had joined her mother now, standing protectively at her side, though her eyes never left the enormous arachnid. The spider, Matilda, as Margaret had called her, remained perfectly still on the casket lid, her 8 legs spread out in what almost looked like a protective stance over the man inside. "Mom," Eliza whispered, "you need to explain. People are freaking out." Margaret nodded and took a deep breath. "This spider," she began, her voice carrying clearly now, "is Matilda. She was my husband's, well, I suppose you could call her his most special research subject, though Edward always said that wasn't quite right." The murmuring in the room quieted as people leaned in to hear. Even those who had been edging toward the doors paused. Edward found her 15 years ago during his last expedition to the Amazon. She was just a tiny thing then, injured and unlikely to survive in the wild. He brought her home, against university regulations, I might add. A small, sad smile crossed Margaret's face at the memory. He nursed her back to health, and when it was time to return her to the wild, he couldn't do it. He'd grown attached, so Matilda became part of our household. Those of you who visited us might have seen her enclosure in Edward's study, though he usually kept it covered when we had company. He knew not everyone shares his appreciation for arachnids. A nervous laugh rippled through the room. It was true that Edward's passion for spiders had always been seen as an endearing eccentricity by most of the town. "But what I don't understand," Margaret continued, her brow furrowing, "is how she got here. Matilda's enclosure is secure. Edward designed it himself, and it's over 2 miles from our house to this chapel." Tom Walsh cleared his throat. "Goliath bird-eaters don't typically travel far from their burrows, and they certainly don't seek out specific locations like this. It's unprecedented behavior." A young woman with glasses who had been one of Edward's students spoke up. "Could someone have brought her here? As some kind of tribute, maybe?" Margaret shook her head. "No one else has the key to her enclosure, and frankly, nobody else could handle her safely except Edward. She's never been aggressive, but she's still a wild creature." The funeral director had regained some of his composure and stepped forward tentatively. "Mrs. Harmon, I understand this spider was important to your husband, but we really need to continue with the service. Perhaps we could contain it somehow? I have a box in the back room." "She," Margaret corrected automatically. "Not it. She. And her name is Matilda." Before the funeral director could respond, the spider moved. The sudden motion caused several people to gasp or step back. But Matilda wasn't lunging or threatening. She was simply repositioning herself on the casket, moving in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern across the polished wood. "Look at that," Tom whispered, his scientific curiosity overcoming his initial shock. "She's making a pattern." Eliza's eyes widened as she watched Matilda move. The spider would take several steps in one direction, stop, tap her front legs in a specific rhythm, then move to another spot and repeat the process. "Mom," Eliza said slowly, "do you remember Dad's communication experiments?" Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my goodness, you don't think—" For years, Edward had been working on a controversial research project involving arachnid intelligence. Most of his colleagues had dismissed his theories that spiders could learn complex communication patterns beyond simple instinct. But Edward had persisted, spending countless hours working with Matilda in particular. "What's happening?" someone asked from the congregation. "What's she doing?" Eliza pulled out her phone and began recording Matilda's movements. My father believed that certain spiders, particularly tarantulas, had greater cognitive abilities than most scientists give them credit for. He developed a system of taps and movements that he thought could be used to communicate simple concepts to them. And you think the spider is trying to communicate now? Pastor Bill asked, his earlier fear giving way to fascination. I don't know, Eliza admitted. But this movement isn't random. Look how she keeps returning to the same spots, tapping in the same pattern. The chapel had grown quiet again, but this time it was a silence of wonder rather than fear. Even those who had been most frightened now leaned forward, watching the strange dance of the giant spider across Edward Harmon's casket. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, pause, 1. Tom counted softly as Matilda tapped. Then she moves to a new position and starts again. Eliza was studying the video on her phone, replaying the sequence. Her face had gone pale. Mom, she whispered. I think she's tapping out Morse code. Margaret stared at her daughter in disbelief. That's not possible. Edward was teaching her simple responses, not Morse code. But Eliza was already pulling up a Morse code chart on her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she compared the patterns. E, she said after a moment. The first pattern is E, 1 dot. She continued watching. And then H, 4 dots. E, H. Mom, she's tapping out Dad's initials. A hush fell over the chapel as this information rippled through the crowd. Edward Harmon's initials being tapped out by his pet spider at his funeral. It was too strange, too perfect to be coincidence. Mrs. Chen, who owned the local bookstore and had been a friend of the Harmons for decades, spoke up from her seat. In many cultures, animals are believed to carry messages from those who have passed on. Her voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. Perhaps Edward is saying goodbye. For some in the room, this suggestion was a step too far into the realm of the supernatural. But for others, including Margaret, there was something deeply comforting about the idea. Edward always said Matilda was special, Margaret said softly. He told me once that working with her had changed his understanding of consciousness itself. The spider had stopped moving now, and was once again perfectly still on the casket. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the fine hairs on her legs, giving them an almost golden glow. Pete, the funeral director, who had been watching this scene unfold with growing amazement, finally found his voice again. Mrs. Harmon, what would you like to do? We need to proceed with the burial. Soon. Margaret thought for a moment, then turned to the congregation. I believe Edward would want Matilda to be part of this. If everyone is comfortable, I'd like to continue with her present. There were nods of agreement throughout the room. The initial fear had largely dissipated, replaced by a sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that somehow felt right for a man who had dedicated his life to understanding creatures that most people feared or overlooked. Pastor, Bill stepped forward again, resuming his position at the podium. Well, this is certainly a first in my 30 years of ministry, he said with a small smile. But I think we've been given a rather remarkable reminder today of Dr. Harmon's life work, that there is intelligence and beauty in all of God's creatures, even those we may not understand. As the service continued, Matilda remained on the casket, a silent sentinel. People who had initially recoiled now leaned forward to get a better look, whispering to each other about what they had witnessed. When it came time to move to the cemetery, Margaret made a decision. She should come with us, she said to Eliza. Edward would want her there. Eliza nodded, though she looked uncertain. But how do we transport her safely? We don't have her carrier. Tom Walsh removed his suit jacket and carefully draped it over his arm. I can try to coax her onto this. I've helped Edward handle her before. With gentle movements and soft words, Tom managed to get Matilda to climb onto the jacket. The large spider seemed unusually cooperative, as if she understood what was happening. The pallbearers lifted Edward's casket to carry it to the hearse. Margaret walked beside Tom, who cradled the jacket with Matilda on it. People stepped back to let them pass, watching with a mixture of awe and lingering nervousness. Outside, the threatened rain had held off, and the afternoon sun broke through the clouds. As the procession moved toward the cemetery, word had already begun to spread through town about the strange events at Dr. Harmon's funeral. By evening, the story of the scientist's loyal spider would be told in every home in Pinewood, but the most extraordinary chapter of this story was yet to unfold. What would happen at the graveside would leave even the most skeptical witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about the natural world, and about the boundaries between life and death. The small procession of cars wound its way through Pinewood's quiet streets toward the hillside cemetery. In the lead car, Margaret sat with Eliza, both women silent, lost in their own thoughts. Tom Walsh rode with them, still cradling his jacket with Matilda perched on it. The spider had remained remarkably calm, barely moving except for the occasional twitch of a leg. "She's never been this docile with anyone but Dad," Eliza remarked, watching Matilda from the corner of her eye. "It's like she knows something's different." Tom nodded. Edward always insisted she recognized him specifically. Most arachnologists would say that's impossible, that their brains aren't complex enough for that kind of recognition. But your father was convinced there was more going on behind those 8 eyes than science has been willing to accept. Margaret reached over and gently touched one of Matilda's legs. The spider didn't flinch or rear back as she might have with a stranger. Edward spent so many hours with her, talking to her, feeding her by hand, running those tests. People thought he was eccentric, but he truly believed he was making a breakthrough. The cemetery came into view, an old but well-kept place with towering oak trees and a wrought iron fence surrounding it. Edward's final resting place would be near the eastern edge, under the branches of a particularly magnificent oak that was said to be over 200 years old. News of what had happened at the chapel had somehow raced ahead of them. A small crowd of curious townspeople had gathered at the cemetery gates hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous spider. A few even had cameras ready. "This is turning into a circus," Eliza muttered, frowning at the onlookers. "Your father wouldn't mind," Margaret said with surprising lightness. "He always said his research needed a wider audience, though I doubt this is what he had in mind." The funeral director had arrived ahead of them and was trying to disperse the crowd, with limited success. As the hearse pulled up and the pallbearers prepared to carry the casket to the gravesite, Margaret stepped out of the car, her head held high. The whispering crowd fell silent as Tom followed, carefully holding his jacket with Matilda still perched on it. "Is that it? The spider?" someone called out. "Her name is Matilda," Margaret corrected firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The authority in her voice seemed to command respect, and the crowd stepped back, making way for the funeral procession to pass. The gravesite had been prepared with rows of folding chairs for the immediate family and close friends. The casket was placed on the lowering device adorned with fresh flowers. Pastor Bill took his position at the head of the grave and opened his prayer book. Tom carefully settled into a chair next to Margaret, still holding Matilda. The spider had become more active now, moving slightly on the jacket as if agitated. "I think she wants to go back to the casket," Tom whispered to Margaret. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Let her." With careful movements, Tom stood and approached the casket. He lowered his jacket beside the floral arrangement, and Matilda immediately crawled onto the polished wood, assuming a position similar to the one she had taken in the chapel. A collective murmur went through the assembled mourners. Even those who had witnessed the earlier events were still stunned by the spider's apparent purposeful behavior. Pastor Bill cleared his throat and began the graveside service. His words about resurrection and eternal life seemed to take on new meaning in the presence of this unusual creature who had somehow found her way to her caretaker's funeral. As the pastor spoke, Matilda began to move again. This time her movements were more elaborate than before. She traced what appeared to be specific patterns across the casket lid, stopping at certain points to tap her front legs against the wood. Eliza, who had been recording on her phone again, suddenly gasped. "Mom," she whispered urgently, "look at this." She tilted her phone screen so Margaret could see. Eliza had been using an app to translate the spider's tapping into Morse code, and a pattern was emerging on the screen. "MISSYOU," Margaret read aloud, her voice breaking. "Oh my God." Tom leaned over to look at the screen, his scientific skepticism battling with what he was seeing with his own eyes. That can't be right. There must be some mistake in the translation. But Eliza shook her head. I've double-checked it, that's what she's tapping. Miss you. The graveside service had come to a standstill as everyone focused on the spider's strange behavior and the whispered conversation among Margaret, Eliza, and Tom. Pastor Bill looked unsure whether to continue or wait. What's happening? Mrs. Chen asked from her seat in the second row. Margaret looked up, tears streaming down her face. She's communicating. Matilda is tapping out a message in Morse code. She's saying, "Miss you." The claim was so extraordinary that it might have been met with disbelief or even mockery under other circumstances. But there was something about the solemnity of the moment, the genuine emotion on Margaret's face, and the bizarre yet undeniable fact of the spider's presence that gave everyone pause. "Let me see," said a man in his 30s, who had been one of Edward's former students. He approached cautiously and looked at Eliza's phone. After studying it for a moment, he nodded slowly. The pattern does match. It's not random. Another of Edward's colleagues from the university stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her initial fear of the large arachnid. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to Eliza's phone. After studying the recording and the translation, the woman looked up, her face pale. This is consistent with Edward's research. He published a paper last year suggesting that certain spiders could be taught to associate specific tapping patterns with rewards. But this goes well beyond what he claimed was possible. Could it be some kind of trick? Someone called from the back. Tom shook his head firmly. I've known Margaret and Eliza for 20 years. They're not hoaxers. And I've been watching Matilda since we left the chapel. No one has been guiding her movements or controlling her in any way. As if to emphasize his point, Matilda began a new sequence of movements across the casket. This time her pattern was even more complex. Eliza continued recording, her hands shaking slightly. She's spelling something else now, it's longer. Everyone waited in tense silence as the translation appeared on Eliza's screen, word by word. "CONTINUEWORK," Eliza read aloud. "Continue work," Margaret repeated, looking stunned. "Edward's research. She's telling us to continue his work." A chill seemed to pass through the gathering. Even the most skeptical among them could not deny the extraordinary nature of what they were witnessing. A spider, supposedly operating on instinct alone, was tapping out coherent messages at her caretaker's funeral. Dr. Linda Powell, the head of the biology department where Edward had taught, stepped forward. She had been watching the proceedings, with a mixture of disbelief and growing wonder. "Edward and I had many arguments about his research," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent cemetery. "I told him he was anthropomorphizing, attributing human characteristics to an animal incapable of such complexity. But seeing this..." She trailed off, watching as Matilda continued her methodical tapping. "There has to be a scientific explanation," Dr. Powell continued after a moment. "Perhaps some kind of conditioning that Edward performed that we're not aware of. But whatever is happening here, it deserves serious study." Tom nodded in agreement. Edward would want his work to continue. He always said he was just scratching the surface of what these creatures are capable of understanding. As the academics discussed the scientific implications, Margaret remained focused on Matilda. There was something deeply personal about the spider's presence that transcended scientific curiosity. Whether through some incredible feat of arachnid intelligence or something more mysterious, Matilda had formed a connection with Edward that had somehow survived his death. "I think," Margaret said softly, "that we should finish the service now, with Matilda present." Pastor Bill, who had been watching this unfolding drama with increasing amazement, nodded and returned to his prayer book. As he spoke the final blessing, Matilda grew still once more. Her 8 legs spread out over Edward's name, which was engraved on a small brass plate on the casket lid. When it came time for the casket to be lowered into the ground, Margaret faced a dilemma. Matilda couldn't go into the grave. She was very much alive and would need to return to her enclosure eventually. But the spider showed no signs of wanting to move. "What should we do?" Eliza whispered to her mother. Margaret thought for a moment, then approached the casket. With gentle hands, she reached out toward Matilda. To everyone's surprise, the spider allowed herself to be picked up, climbing onto Margaret's outstretched palm without hesitation. "She's never let me hold her before," Margaret said, wonder in her voice. Only Edward. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Margaret stood at the edge of the grave with Matilda perched on her hand. One by one, people came forward to toss flowers or handfuls of dirt onto the casket, each of them glancing with a mixture of fear and fascination at the giant spider who seemed to be mourning alongside them. When the brief ceremony was complete, and people began to disperse toward their cars, Margaret found herself surrounded by Edward's colleagues from the university. "Margaret," Dr. Powell said, "I know this isn't the time, but I think we need to study what happened here today." Edwards, "Research. If what we've seen is real, it could change our entire understanding of arachnid cognition." Margaret looked down at Matilda, who sat calmly on her hand, showing no signs of aggression or fear. "Edward would want that," she agreed. "But Matilda isn't a lab specimen. She was his friend. Whatever studies happen, we'll need to respect that." Dr. Powell nodded. "Of course. We could set up observation equipment in your home where she's comfortable, non-invasive studies only." As they spoke, a young reporter who had slipped into the cemetery approached, notepad in hand. "Mrs. Harmon, I'm from the Pinewood Gazette. Is it true that your husband's pet spider showed up at his funeral and tapped out a message to you?" Margaret exchanged glances with Eliza and Tom. What had happened today was extraordinary, perhaps even unbelievable to those who hadn't witnessed it. Once word got out, there would be more reporters, more questions, more people wanting to see the amazing communicating spider for themselves. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Edward had always believed his research could change how people viewed these misunderstood creatures. Maybe Matilda's remarkable appearance at his funeral was her way of helping that happen. "Yes," Margaret told the reporter, her voice steady and clear. "And I think my husband would say it's about time the rest of the world started paying attention." Within 48 hours, the story of Matilda the spider had spread far beyond the small town of Pinewood. What began as a brief article in the local gazette was quickly picked up by regional news, then national outlets, and finally international media. The headline, "Spider Mourns Scientist at Funeral, Taps Out Messages," was met with equal parts fascination and skepticism. Margaret's phone rang constantly. Her email inbox filled faster than she could empty it. Reporters camped at the end of her driveway, hoping for a glimpse of the now famous arachnid. "This is madness," Eliza said, as she peeked through the living room curtains at the small crowd gathered outside. It was the third day after the funeral, and the media presence showed no signs of diminishing. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She looked exhausted, but somehow more alive than she had since Edward's death. "Your father would have loved this." All these people suddenly interested in spiders. Upstairs in Edward's study, Matilda had been returned to her large, custom-built enclosure. The space was climate-controlled to mimic the humidity and temperature of her native Amazon. Plants grew inside, along with hiding spots made of bark and stone. A small camera had been installed in one corner, the first piece of monitoring equipment approved by Margaret. Dr. Powell from the university had assembled a team of researchers who were eager to study Matilda's apparent communication abilities. They had set up a temporary headquarters in the Harmons' dining room, with computers and scientific equipment crowding out the furniture. "We need to establish baseline behaviors," Dr. Powell explained to Margaret and Eliza over breakfast. "If Matilda can truly communicate in the way you've described, we need to document it under controlled conditions." Tom Walsh, who had taken a leave of absence from his teaching duties to participate in the research, nodded in agreement. "The scientific community is extremely skeptical, as you can imagine. The videos from the funeral are being called elaborate hoaxes." "But you were there," Eliza protested. "You saw it with your own eyes." Tom smiled sadly. In science, personal testimony isn't enough, especially for a claim this extraordinary. We need repeatable results under controlled conditions. Margaret pushed her plate away untouched. I don't care what people believe, I know what I saw, and I know Edward wasn't delusional about Matilda's abilities. That's why this research is so important, Dr. Powell said gently. We owe it to Edward to continue his work, to prove he was right. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. It was Dr. Huang, a neurobiologist who had flown in from California overnight after hearing about Matilda. He carried a case of specialized equipment designed to measure electrical activity in the spider's body. This is non-invasive, he assured Margaret when she looked concerned. Completely painless. We'll use tiny sensors on the outside of her exoskeleton to measure neural impulses. Margaret hesitated, then nodded her approval. Edward would have wanted to know how her brain works, but if she shows any signs of distress, we stop immediately. As the scientists set up their equipment upstairs, the doorbell rang again. This time it was a courier with a package. Inside was a letter from the head of the National Science Foundation, expressing interest in funding a formal study of Matilda. This is getting bigger by the hour, Eliza said, scanning the letter. Mom, are you sure you're okay with all of this? We're still grieving Dad, and now our house has turned into a research lab. Margaret touched her daughter's arm. This is what keeps me going right now, knowing that your father's work matters, that people are finally paying attention. Her eyes grew misty. And there's something comforting about having Matilda here. It's like having a piece of him still with us. Upstairs, the research team had gathered around Matilda's enclosure. They had set up a system of small wooden blocks that the spider could manipulate. Each block had a different letter painted on it. The idea was to see if Matilda could arrange them to form words. This seems far-fetched, one young researcher whispered to another. Spiders don't have the cognitive capacity for symbolic language. Doctor, Huang overheard and shook his head. A week ago I would have agreed with you, but I've reviewed Edward Harmon's research papers going back 15 years. His documentation was meticulous. He believed that certain arachnid species have evolved neural pathways that we've completely overlooked because we weren't looking for them. Dr. Powell carefully opened one side of Matilda's enclosure. The spider remained in her favorite spot, partially hidden beneath a piece of bark. The question is whether what happened at the funeral was a one-time event, perhaps triggered by some environmental factor we don't understand, or whether she can consistently demonstrate this level of cognitive function. They waited, cameras recording from multiple angles, sensors ready to capture any unusual neural activity. For nearly an hour, Matilda didn't move. Some of the researchers began to fidget, checking their watches or scrolling through their phones. Then, without warning, Matilda emerged from her hiding spot. She moved with purpose toward the wooden blocks, her movements deliberate and precise. The room fell silent as the giant spider approached the nearest block, touched it with her front legs, then pushed it aside. She did the same with the next block and the next, appearing to examine each one carefully. She's looking for specific letters, Tom whispered, barely breathing. After examining all 12 blocks, Matilda began to move them. Using her front legs with surprising dexterity, she pushed certain blocks into a line while ignoring others. The researchers watched, transfixed, as a message slowly formed. DWARD. My God, Dr. Powell breathed. She spelled his name, the Phi. Neural sensors were registering unusual activity now, patterns that Dr. Huang had never seen before in arachnid subjects. This is remarkable, he said, studying the readouts. The complexity of these signals. It's more like what we'd expect from a small mammal than from a spider. Matilda wasn't finished. She continued moving blocks, arranging them in a new configuration. UHERE, where? Tom read aloud. She's asking where Edward is. The profound sadness of this moment struck everyone in the room. How could they explain death to a spider? And yet Matilda's behavior suggested a level of awareness that made the question seem less absurd than it would have just days ago. Margaret had come upstairs to watch and now stepped forward. May I? She asked Dr. Powell, who nodded and moved. Aside. Margaret knelt beside the open enclosure at eye level with Matilda. "Edward is gone," she said softly, as if speaking to a child. "He died. His body is in the ground. But whatever made him, Edward isn't here anymore." The spider remained, motionless, her 8 eyes fixed on Margaret's face. There was no way to know if she understood, but something about her stillness suggested she was listening. Then, slowly, Matilda moved back to the blocks. She pushed them around again, forming a new message, KNOW. "No," Eliza read. "She's saying she knows." A chill ran through the room. The implications were staggering. If Matilda truly understood the concept of death, it would upend everything science thought it knew about arachnid cognition. Dr. Huang was frantically taking notes, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "We need to run a series of tests to determine the full extent of her language comprehension. Can she answer questions? Does she understand abstract concepts beyond simple object recognition?" The research team spent the rest of the day designing experiments to test Matilda's abilities. They created more complex block arrangements, introduced new words, even tried simple math problems. To their amazement, Matilda engaged with every challenge, demonstrating a level of intelligence that defied all existing research on arachnid capabilities. By evening, when the team finally took a break, they had filled notebooks with observations and generated gigabytes of video data. Dr. Powell sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and Eliza, her face showing both excitement and profound disbelief. "I've been a biologist for 30 years, she said, running her hands through her gray hair. "I've never seen anything like this. It contradicts everything we thought we knew about arthropod neurophysiology." "Edward knew," Margaret said simply. "He tried to tell the scientific community for years. No one would listen." "We're listening now," Tom assured her, "and once we publish these findings, the whole world will listen too." As they spoke, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a producer at a major news network, requesting an exclusive interview about Matilda. Similar requests had been coming in all day. "We need to be careful about how we present this to the public," Dr. Powell cautioned. "The claims we're making are extraordinary. We need extraordinary evidence to back them up." "We have the evidence," Eliza said, holding up her tablet, which showed a compilation of the day's videos. Matilda just rewrote the books on spider intelligence right in front of our eyes. Over the next few days, the research continued. Scientists from around the world began arriving in Pinewood, drawn by the remarkable preliminary findings that had been shared through academic channels. The Harmon House became the center of what many were already calling a revolutionary moment in the study of animal cognition. Each day brought new discoveries about Matilda's abilities. She could solve puzzles designed for primates. She demonstrated memory retention by recalling specific sequences of blocks from previous days. Most remarkably, she appeared to have emotional responses, reacting differently to recordings of Edward's voice than to voices of strangers. The media attention intensified. Margaret agreed to a single television interview, which was broadcast nationally during prime time. She spoke eloquently about Edward's research and his belief that humans had vastly underestimated the intelligence of spiders. "Edward used to say that we're blind to intelligence that doesn't look like our own," she told the interviewer. "We recognize it in dolphins and chimps because they're more like us. But Matilda has shown us that incredible cognitive abilities can exist in minds, very different from our own." The interview included carefully selected video clips of Matilda's block-moving communications. Viewers across the country watched in astonishment as the giant spider spelled out words and responded to questions. By the end of the first week after the funeral, Edward's old university had announced the creation of the Edward Harmon Initiative for Arachnid Intelligence, a new research program dedicated to continuing his work. Private donations poured in, along with offers of research partnerships from institutions around the world. In Edward's study, now transformed into a state-of-the-art research lab, Margaret sat alone with Matilda late one night after the scientists had gone. The house was finally quiet. "You've changed everything, you know," she told the spider, who had emerged from her hiding spot as if recognizing Margaret's voice. "Edward always said you would. He believed in you when no one else did." Matilda moved to the edge of her enclosure, closest to Margaret. Her front legs rested on the glass, almost like a child pressing their hands against a window. Margaret placed her palm against the glass, mirroring the spider's posture. "I miss him too," she whispered. And in that quiet moment, the true miracle wasn't just that a spider could communicate. It was that grief and loss could be understood across the vast evolutionary distance between two entirely different species. 6 months had passed since that remarkable day when Matilda appeared on Edward's casket. The world had changed in ways no one could have predicted, and at the center of it all was a spider who had challenged humanity's understanding of intelligence itself. Spring had come to Pinewood, bringing with it new life and a sense of renewal. The Harmon house, once a private family home, had been transformed. The garage had been converted into a state-of-the-art laboratory. The backyard now featured a gleaming glass building, a climate-controlled habitat specially designed for Matilda and several other tarantulas that had been brought in for comparative studies. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching a group of graduate students taking notes in the garden. Her hair had more gray now, but there was a new energy about her. Grief still visited in quiet moments, but it was balanced by purpose and wonder. "The donors are arriving at noon," Eliza reminded, her coming into the kitchen with her tablet in hand. Eliza had taken an extended leave from her marine biology position in Australia to help manage what had become known globally as the Matilda Project. Margaret nodded, glancing at her watch. "Is everything ready at the center?" The Edward Harmon Center for Arachnid Studies had been built on land donated by the university, just a mile from the Harmon home. Today was its official opening, a moment that would have seemed impossible just half a year ago. "Dr. Powell says they're putting the finishing touches on Matilda's display habitat now," Eliza replied. "It's amazing, Mom." Dad would have been speechless. A car pulled into the driveway and they both recognized Tom Walsh's battered old station wagon. He had become the unofficial co-director of the project, working alongside Dr. Powell to continue Edward's research. Tom had aged in these 6 months too, his beard now fully gray, but his eyes sparkled with the excitement of discovery. "Ready for the big day?" he asked as he entered through the back door, not bothering to knock. He had become like family in these months of intensive work. "As ready as we'll ever be," Margaret answered. "How's our girl this morning?" By our girl, she meant Matilda, of course. The giant spider had become something of a family member to the Harmons, a living connection to Edward and now a scientific marvel that had changed their lives forever. "Peaceful," Tom said. She completed the new symbolism test this morning. 16 correct responses in a row. The research team is beside themselves. Over the months, Matilda had continued to demonstrate abilities that defied all previous understanding of arachnid intelligence. She could now communicate using not just letter blocks but also symbolic images. She could solve complex puzzles, demonstrate memory retention spanning weeks, and even show preferences for certain researchers over others. Most remarkably, she had begun teaching some of her abilities to younger spiders. 2 juvenile Goliath bird-eaters raised in captivity were now showing early signs of the same communication patterns after spending time in Matilda's habitat. "The press will be all over this," Eliza sighed. "I've already had to turn down 3 more interview requests this morning alone." The scientific community had moved from skepticism to cautious acceptance, and finally to outright excitement about the Matilda phenomenon. Peer-reviewed papers had been published in the world's most prestigious journals. Research grants had poured in from governments and private foundations alike. And today, the center that would house this groundbreaking work would officially open its doors. "We should get going," Margaret said, checking her appearance one last time in the hallway mirror. "I want to see Matilda before the ceremony." The drive to the center took only a few minutes. As they approached, they could see the impressive new building gleaming in the spring sunlight. The architecture was intentionally distinctive. 8 wings radiating from a central dome, mimicking the shape of a spider. Above the main entrance, large letters spelled out, "Edward Harmon Center for Arachnid Studies," with a smaller line beneath reading, Where understanding crosses species boundaries. Security personnel nodded respectfully as Margaret, Eliza, and Tom entered through a side door, avoiding the growing crowd of visitors and media at the main entrance. They made their way through pristine corridors to the heart of the facility, the special habitat designed specifically for Matilda. The space was a marvel of engineering. It recreated a section of Amazonian rainforest in meticulous detail, with living plants, carefully controlled humidity, and natural light filtering through specially designed panels. At the center was Matilda's main living area, visible to visitors, through one-way glass but designed to give her privacy when she wanted it. Dr. Powell was waiting for them, clipboard in hand, her usual air of scientific precision softened today by obvious emotion. "She's waiting for you," she told Margaret. "She's been at the glass all morning." Sure enough, Matilda was positioned near the viewing panel, her large form immediately recognizable. At 6 years old, she had reached her full size, impressive even for her species. Her dark body contrasted with the rich greens of the plants surrounding her. There was a special entrance that allowed Margaret to enter the habitat, a privilege granted to no one else. The bond between the woman and the spider had deepened over the months, becoming something that defied scientific explanation, but was undeniable to anyone who witnessed it. Margaret entered alone, moving carefully along the path to where Matilda waited. The spider approached without hesitation, her movements deliberate and gentle. "Today's the big day, old friend," Margaret said softly, kneeling down to be at eye level with Matilda. "Edward's dream is coming true. People are finally understanding what he always knew about you." Matilda's front legs moved in what had become a familiar gesture, a form of greeting she used only with Margaret. Nearby, a small table held the wooden letter blocks that had been part of their early communication system. Though more sophisticated methods had been developed, Matilda still seemed to prefer these simple tools for personal interactions. The spider moved to the blocks and began arranging them with practiced ease. Margaret watched, still filled with wonder even after months of witnessing this miracle. "Proud. Yes," Margaret whispered, tears filling her eyes. "He would be so proud. Of you. Of all of this." From an observation room, Eliza and Tom watched this interaction on a monitor, both moved by the simplicity and depth of the connection they were witnessing. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," Eliza said. "A spider, communicating like this." Tom nodded, his scientific mind still grappling with the implications. "Your father saw what no one else could see. He looked past all our preconceptions about what intelligence should look like." An hour later, the main atrium of the center was filled with people. Donors in expensive suits mingled with scientists in casual attire. University officials shook hands with government representatives. Journalists set up cameras and microphones, preparing to broadcast the opening ceremony worldwide. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd with Eliza and Tom beside her. Behind them, a large screen showed a live feed from Matilda's habitat, where the spider was visible watching the proceedings through her one-way glass. "6 months ago," Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, "a spider appeared at my husband's funeral. Many people were frightened. Some thought it was a bad omen. No one could have imagined that this moment was the beginning of a scientific revolution." She paused, looking back at the screen where Matilda sat perfectly still, as if listening. "Edward Harmon spent his life telling anyone who would listen that we've been looking at intelligence all wrong, that we recognize it only when it resembles our own, that we've been blind to the vast, diverse forms of consciousness that exist all around us." The crowd was silent, captivated. "What Matilda has shown us goes beyond arachnid intelligence. She has forced us to reconsider our place in the natural world, to question our assumptions about the boundaries between species, to wonder what other minds might be trying to communicate with us if only we would learn to listen." On the screen, Matilda moved to her letter blocks and began to arrange them. The camera zoomed in, and the audience gasped as a message formed. "NEWBEGINNING, a new beginning," Margaret read aloud. "Yes, that's exactly what today represents." The ceremony continued with speeches from university officials and a ribbon cutting at the main research lab. Visitors were then invited to tour the facility, with the highlight being the observation area where they could view Matilda in her habitat. Throughout the day, people stood in awe before the glass, watching as the giant spider moved with purpose through her environment, occasionally interacting with researchers through various communication tools. Children pressed their faces to the safety glass. Their fear of spiders transformed into fascination. As evening fell and the crowds thinned, Margaret found herself alone in the observation area. The center would officially open to the public. Tomorrow, but tonight in the quiet, she could reflect on the journey that had brought them here. She placed her hand against the glass. On the other side, Matilda approached and mirrored the gesture, her front leg touching the spot where Margaret's palm rested. "You know," Margaret said softly, "sometimes I think Edward somehow lives on through you, that he found a way to keep teaching us, to keep pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible." It was a fanciful thought, not one she would share with the scientists. But in moments like this, with Matilda's 8 eyes seeming to look straight into her soul, it didn't seem so impossible. A soft chime indicated the center systems were transitioning to night mode. The lighting in Matilda's habitat gradually dimmed to mimic sunset, signaling the end of the day. Margaret reluctantly prepared to leave. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more questions, more discoveries. The work that Edward had started was now being carried forward by hundreds of researchers around the world. New studies of animal intelligence were being launched, informed by the paradigm shift that Matilda had initiated. As she turned to go, Margaret noticed movement in the habitat. Matilda had gone to her blocks one last time and was arranging them. In the fading light, THANKYOUT, simple words that bridged an evolutionary gap of hundreds of millions of years, a connection between species that should have been impossible. A reminder that consciousness and communication might take forms humans had never imagined. Margaret smiled through her tears. "No, Matilda," she whispered. "Thank you." Outside the center, the spring evening was cool and clear. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret took a moment to look up at them, thinking of Edward and how he had always encouraged her to look beyond the obvious, to question assumptions, to remain open to wonder. A small plaque beside the center's entrance caught her eye. It featured a quote from Edward's final research paper. "Perhaps the greatest discoveries await us not in distant stars, but in the misunderstood minds of the small creatures with whom we share our world." How right he had been, and how fitting that his legacy would live on, not just in human memory, but in the remarkable mind of a spider who had appeared on his casket to say goodbye, and in doing so, had said hello to a whole new understanding of the world.